Anniversaries, depending on what they are, they carry a lot of memories. Mostly they are all collective memories of different people, different time. And for this particular one, where we are celebrating the pioneers of the ordination of the first ministers in the Presbyterian Church of East Africa, for me it's quite a great welcome, because it's something that I identify with, even though I wasn't there in 1926. Going back to 1926, one of the 8 ministers who were ordained from the Church of Scotland Mission then was Paul Kahuho Wagashoba, who happens to have been a brother to my maternal grandmother, Waruguru Wagashoba. So that's my connection with him and his family. And I think what is most significant as far as my mother is concerned is that Waruguru was a single parent. And so Kahuho was the father figure of her and her siblings. But more significantly, he was not just a father figure, but he was the spiritual guide of my mother, Mudhoni wa Waruguru Wagashoba. So that connection is something that I identify with, because she always told us the stories of their childhood, and how significant it was that there was somebody like him and his wife, Mukami, who became the spiritual guide of my mother. My mother got married, they got married in 1939, and because she was born in Madeira, Tumutumu, that's where my father went to study, to become a teacher. She studied to become a midwife, and so they were in the same mission station at the same time, and that's how they met. So when they got married, my father was a teacher, and so they had to, of course, after the marriage, they moved to Murang'a, Geda, where my father came from. And at Geda, in 1933-34, the Kenyans who had received the gospel from the missionary, Church of Scotland missionaries, they had already started a congregation, a church at Geda. And so my father was one of those people who literally helped the church to grow from the late 1930s. And so that's where they settled. Of course, they got married at the end of 1939. So from 1940, that became their home. My father continued being a teacher, and my mother continued to be a midwife, because the missionaries accepted that she could. She had a certificate, midwifery certificate, but she was also offered equipment to use wherever she went. So she finally became the midwife of the entire village and in the entire area for the next more or less 40 years. So that's the basis of their being together. I think it's important for us to remember from the early beginnings, when the missionaries came. Obviously there were Kenyan young women and men who received the gospel, but also received the education that they were offering. And from those days, when we go back to the archives, we encounter how they became evangelists themselves. And 1920 becomes very, very significant, because that's when we had the first elders. So within the Presbyterian system of leadership, you can't become a minister before you have become an elder. So I think that's something that should not be overlooked, and it's very good that when 2020 the church celebrated the first church elders who were ordained in 1920, and among them were the 8 who became ordained. It's also significant that by that time the missionaries had found it necessary to introduce theological education. So these people are not just ordained without theological education which was offered at that time by the missionaries. So these were the 8 men spent quality time being prepared to be ministers, and of course it must have been a hard task because most of them had basic English language, and the missionaries obviously were also learning how to speak Gikuyu language. So we can only imagine how those classes were when the two are trying to understand each other. But basically, from what I have read, these were very dedicated men in terms of engaging in theological education, which I think the Presbyterian Church has continued to offer, because it's very few circumstances when clergy have been ordained when they have not taken the full load of theological education, 3 years, 4 years, and that's important for the ministry. What was interesting from what I read is that actually these 2 women had not even been baptized, but they were sent from Thogoto, Kikuyu, to Tomotomo to prepare the way for Marion Stevenson, who we nicknamed Nyamashaki. And so that even when we look back at women elders and women ministers in the Presbyterian Church, we should never forget that there were these young girls. They were hardly women. And unfortunately, because of the time when they came back from Tomotomo, they died from influenza. So we really don't know much about their families and all that. But the fact that they were women to pave the way for another woman, the missionary, was very significant. And Mashaki was very significant because she was not just there for women. She was also involved in the translation of the New Testament, and she mastered the language, so that was very helpful for her in the engagement of the men who are training for the ministry. So Nyamashaki, for me, was quite a role model for me when I started going back to her story, to know that she was not just there for the women, but she was there for the entire community. And obviously she was a very brave woman. They used to walk long distances. And so this whole concept of women being weak, it's not the picture you get from Marion, you get from the other women who are her counterparts in different mission stations. You can become theologically trained, but you are not necessarily being trained to become a minister. Now, this has changed in the last few decades, because basically those days when you went to seminary or theological college, you were there to train as a minister, and majority of them ended up being ordained. There are few who went through that process, didn't get ordained by choice, but they ended up working in the church, like Mr. Giraine, who was in charge of youth for a very long time. He was theologically trained, but he chose not to be ordained. But that was very rare. Today, of course, things have changed, where we from itself, they separated undertaking theological education from ordination. And obviously that has allowed a lot of, mostly women, who know that the possibilities of ordination are not there, but they want the theological education, even to the advanced level. They have continued to do that, and then they offer their services in the society without ordination, or even in the church. Yeah. So that we have to look at that, because there is a specific time when that separation was done by church leaders, but also by theological educators in a place like St. Paul's. I think one of the things as scholars we could do is to look at the development of theological and now, and what has influenced from a societal perspective, what has influenced the changes. Because suddenly today, when we look at the kind of theologies that we have, and you have mentioned some which have been labeled misleading theologies, prosperity gospel and all that, there are also other theologies that have developed. And for the people who went to South Africa, obviously because of the nature of racism in South Africa, which was also part of the Kenyan society, we were kind of an apartheid system, because we had the whites, we had the Indians, and then we had the Africans. And that's the same pattern that South Africa had taken. And in fact, in South Africa, they had very significant areas for each group called coloreds. So that experience that they had when they came back, it must have made a lot of differences for them, also to be able to examine how the missionaries were treating Africans. Was there racism? If there was, then how did they tackle that? I think that is very significant. Obviously, we had St. Andrew's, which was significant in the sense that it was the church for the Scots, whereas you had Bahati, which came later, which was very much the Africa for the Africans. But there was a lot of interaction in between, so you can't just specifically say that Africans did not have any influence at St. Andrew's, even though it was meant for the Scots. So I think those are the things that you look at. And the way theology is shaped is by the questions we raise. Personally, when I ended up in the parish, I encountered a lot of issues that were coming from the young people, from the women, from the men, and I had to ask myself, how come that some of these questions were not part of the curriculum? Yeah. And that's what provoked me at the end to actually look critically, what do we mean by African theology? But also African theology which is addressing our issues. And that's why I ended up doing Christian social ethics as a major in my studies, because when I was at myself, why are we so poor? Because I encountered urban poverty, which I didn't know much about, because I grew up in the village. And when we did urban ministry at St. Paul's, it was a very short period of time. We were exposed to the urban setting, but really it didn't become the core. It was not part of the core of our theological curriculum. So those questions for me, the issues of violence, particularly in the homes, teenage pregnancies, those social issues, including alcoholism, which you have mentioned, mental illnesses, we didn't even know how to really deal with people in such circumstances. So those questions that I started asking, I didn't feel fit to be in the parish ministry. Those are the tools I went looking for when I went back to school. What is the genesis of the Women's Guild of today? And from the Goto, there was more of the talk of girls guild. But from Tomotomo, we have these young men who literally started the Kiamakeango, the Council of the Shield. And eventually it merged with the Girls Guild, and which later became the Women's Guild, taking the pattern from the Church of Scotland. Yeah. And for me that was significant because the Kiamakeango, they were not just talking gospel. Yeah. They were also looking at the socio-cultural dynamics of what was putting the girl and the young woman down. Yeah. And obviously with the Kiamakeango, the female circumcision issue was very, very critical. Yeah. And when we ask the questions of who are really most of the times you find the missionaries being lifted up, but the young women literally said no, and some of them suffered rejection from their families, let alone the fact that they were also rejected for pursuing education in itself. But that first group of young women who at Tomotomo witnessed a woman die at childbirth. And when they learned and they discovered this is what it is, they literally said, we are not going to have this done to our children because they do it themselves. I think that story for me has been missed a lot. And there are socio-cultural issues that are affecting our girls today. Young women, married women, single women. Those women were so courageous to defy the order of the Gikuyu way of life. Was not a small thing. Yeah. I found that story very interesting when I was writing my thesis on the Women's Guild and those pioneer women, when I came across a footnote where a woman in Netherlands had said, the Gikuyu women were very passive. This was the battle being fought by the missionaries. And I had grown up with the story from my own mother of the women who really said no, these young women who said no to female circumcision of the day. And I interviewed some of I still remember going to Tabitha Muriuki, who was one of the students at Tomotomo. They were being trained to be nurses and midwives, who were among those who literally had to go to the district officer, who was a Muzungu, to say we are not going to have this done. And they had to have an interpreter. Yeah. And the interpreter was a Gikuyu man who just looked at them and said, when did you see an uncircumcised girl or woman give birth? Because for them, they would not have imagined one who had not been circumcised becoming a mother. Yeah. And so those were some of the stories that I gathered. And so for me, because of course when I went to ministry, there weren't others who had been ordained ministers. So I was looking for role models. Yeah. Yeah. And these were the women who became my role models, and including my own mother. Briefly, in the 1940s, we find that women were being trained to be Bible women, or what they called sisters. So the whole concept of them becoming like evangelists in the communities was there, and quite a number were trained, but eventually that was discontinued. The other thing that happened is that quite a number of the women who got education became midwives, nurses, teachers, because basically those were the professions that were open for women then. They were not just midwives and teachers. They also became evangelists, particularly those wherever they got married, because most of them got married. Those who didn't get married, they stayed back home, but they continued. So the whole question of evangelism among women was also there. Towards the end of 1940s, we also find women starting to serve as deacons in the local churches. And in the 50s is when now we see this move of the second generation of women asking, why can't we be ordained elders? Their argument, as far as I understand, is that the Bible has all these women who participated in ministry, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. They were involved in the whole story of salvation. And why does it stop them from becoming elders? So they started asking that question also for ministers. So, and then obviously the people they were talking to were the men who are in leadership. Some of these men were their husbands, because most of these women, quite a number of them, were the spouses. And so they understood a lot of church leadership, because they would learn what is really going on, even in the sessions, because there's no way sometimes you don't have to talk about the joys and the challenges of ministry, whether you are an elder or whether you are a minister. So that's the background of that. And when I interviewed women, people like Priscilla Mireka, Eda Gashukia, and others, their main reasoning was, we have role models in the Bible. So we don't see what is this theological argument that we can't be. And so the church in 1964 accepted the ordination of women elders. And then it was like, let's see how they will perform, and then we can continue to discuss the ordination of women. And so, but at one point, the young people really raised that question. They said, why are women not getting ordained as ministers? Yes.
In the General Assembly.
In the General Assembly. And they asked the question. And again, then the momentum started, and the women took it up. The church leaders of the day took it up. Some of them were very open about it, and that's how it was taken up. The goodness with the Presbyterian system of government is that when you are an elder, you can participate in decision making all the way to the General Assembly. But obviously, there were very few women elders who ended up pairing the minister to go to the presbytery and then to go to the General Assembly. But because of the Women's Guild, and which was very strong in the late 50s and the 60s, they would be at the assembly, not as delegates, but representing the Women's Guild. So they had a voice, but they didn't have a vote. And the voice, I think sometimes we forget, when you are going to take tea and lunch, is when you have some of these things discussed informally, but they influence the discussion at the assembly.
The formal discussion.
The formal discussion. And when the discussion came in 1973, and they couldn't get the vote, then of course the presbyteries had to vote. And there were 8 presbyteries. And 4 said yes and 4 said no.
That is in
1973, 76.
Okay. In between there.
In between. So that's why the vote had to go to the General Assembly in 1976. And Reverend Gatto writes in his book how he decided to request that the women who are not delegates, who are delegates but not official voting members, may be allowed to say something about why women should be, so that at the end there was a women's voices. And that's when Dr. Eda Gashukia raised the question, brought the issue of womanhood and the advantages that come with motherhood and being a woman, that it brings good elements into the whole ministry. And others also contributed. And as far as I know from the records of the assembly, I think there was only one dissenting voice at the end of the vote, which again was only the men. And so that was 76, which hopefully we also celebrate next year. But for you to become a minister, then you had to be theologically trained. So if you look at the resolution, it has two portions. That women now are allowed to be theologically trained and then to be ordained. So those two are very significant resolutions that went hand in hand.
Okay.
And fortunately for me, my father by then was retired, but he was in the assembly.
Mm-hmm.
So when he came home,
Okay.
I got to know that the vote was positive.
Yeah.
I still remember I could have been 11 years old, my father's asking me, what would you like to become? Which I think was a common question in our home.
Yeah.
Having two professionals, my father was quite keen to know what his children want to become. And so I said, Dad, I want to be a teacher like you, but if the church allowed, I would also like to be a minister like you.
Oh, so he knew you had that in your heart.
I told him. He was just asking the way parents ask those questions. And I told him, if the church opens the door, I would consider ministry. And so when he came home and told me the vote has been positive, the rest is her story. When the church was ready to train, the announcement came to the local congregations from the training. So we were informed in the parishes, and I was an active member of my local congregation at Geda church. And so when that information came, I presented myself to the elders, and they took my case to the parish. My parish took my case to the presbytery, and so I did all the interviews. I think the fact that no dissenting voice came from the local elders, and I don't know personally anybody who objected to it among the elders in the local congregation and even at the parish level. So, but I can imagine that there were people who really wondered what's going on here, particularly those people who are not very conversant with the whole discussion through the presbyteries and through the General Assembly.
Yeah.
But my local congregation, when the women were allowed to become elders, 6 women were ordained in 1969. 5, when my mother was ordained. So we grew up knowing women elders. So to become a minister, I think, for that context, it was not a big question mark. But of course, as you went on, probably Reverend Joya can tell more stories about what happened at the training.
At the training? Oh.
Interview.
Okay.
Because he was then in charge of the training.
In charge of the training.
Yeah, when I did the interviews was 1977. St. Paul's had accepted a woman in 1976 who was a refugee from Uganda, from Bishop Tucker College. That was during the Idi Amin's time. So when I went there, I found Mildred Ochora. And so she was the first, but then I was the first Kenyan. I went to do Bachelor of Divinity because I already had my S1 diploma from Kenya Science Teachers Training College. I was already a teacher. I had already taught for almost 2 years by that time. To begin with, at St. Paul's, the Presbyterian students were very receptive. They were very supportive of me. Of course, they were all men. I had a few of them in my class, but that's what I did doing the diploma and the certificate. Some had already been ordained, those who came to do Bachelor of Divinity with me. And so I had that community which was very supportive. But St. Paul's being what it is with other denominations, I won't mention them, but there were some who couldn't receive communion from a woman. And those are things that continue here and there, even within the Presbyterian Church. So it's not, it didn't deter me from pursuing my studies and my calling. I was posted to Bahati. I came from Muranga Presbytery because that's a presbytery that I belong to. But after I got married, then because my husband was based in Nairobi, I then became part of Nairobi Presbytery. So in the training and the appointment committee, they decided that I go to PCA Bahati. And at Bahati, before I went to Bahati, in that process, I got ordained as an elder in April of 1980 by the Dagoretti parish, because Njoroge belonged to Dagoretti parish. And so by the time I came to Bahati, I was already a church elder, which obviously shocked the elders at Bahati, because at that point, Bahati parish had not accepted to ordain women elders. I come as a student, as a theological student, and the first question they were interested in, how can I participate in the session? And I'm not an elder. That was the assumption, because I was a woman and I was young. And then Reverend Wayaki did the speaking on my behalf and said I had been ordained as an elder. And then they couldn't stop me from attending the session. And I think my presence at Bahati motivated the session to consider women elders, because in 1983, they accepted to ordain the first 2 women elders. They were not from Bahati congregation, they were from Kariobangi South. Yes. Yeah, but today I witnessed that Bahati parish has a lot of women elders. So things have changed a lot.